Cleopatra VII Philopator did not become one of the most discussed figures in history because she was beautiful. That idea, repeated endlessly in popular culture, is itself a political artifact. Cleopatra became dangerous because she ruled. And more importantly, because she ruled independently, in a world increasingly unwilling to tolerate power that did not originate in Rome. By the time of her death in 30 BCE, Cleopatra was no longer simply the queen of Egypt. She was the last sovereign ruler of a Hellenistic kingdom that controlled the most critical economic artery of the Mediterranean world: grain. Egypt fed Rome. Whoever controlled Egypt did not merely possess land or wealth, they held leverage over the stability of the Roman state itself. This fact alone explains why Cleopatra could never be allowed to survive the rise of Octavian. Rome did not fear Cleopatra as a woman. It feared her as a political system. Egypt under Cleopatra was not a declining, ornamental monarchy waiting to be annexed. It was a centralized, bureaucratically efficient state with a stable economy, a powerful religious structure, and a ruler who understood both symbolism and strategy. Cleopatra spoke multiple languages. She governed directly rather than through Roman intermediaries. She appeared not as a Roman client queen, but as Pharaoh, a divine ruler in Egyptian tradition, not subordinate to the Senate, not accountable to Roman law. That distinction mattered. Rome tolerated client kings only when they behaved as extensions of Roman authority. Cleopatra never did. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not acts of submission. They were calculated partnerships between equals, designed to preserve Egyptian autonomy while leveraging Roman internal conflict. This was unacceptable in the long term. Rome could negotiate with Cleopatra temporarily, but it could not coexist with her permanently. The problem was not her ambition. The problem was her competence. After Caesar's assassination, Rome entered a prolonged identity crisis. Power fractured, alliances shifted, and legitimacy became a weapon rather than a given. In this environment, Cleopatra represented an alternative axis of authority, one rooted not in the Senate, not in Roman tradition, but in dynastic continuity, divine kingship, and economic control. She offered Mark Antony something Octavian could not: resources, stability, and a claim to rule that did not depend on Roman approval. This is where the narrative of romance becomes politically convenient. By reducing Cleopatra's influence to seduction, Roman historians stripped her of agency. A woman who manipulated powerful men with charm was far less threatening than a ruler who negotiated power from a position of strength. The myth of Cleopatra as a temptress was not an accident. It was a strategic reinterpretation designed to erase her legitimacy. Rome did not want future generations to see her as a head of state who nearly reshaped the balance of power in the Mediterranean, because that version of Cleopatra raises uncomfortable questions. If Cleopatra was a serious political actor, then her defeat was not inevitable. It was engineered. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE is often presented as the decisive moment, the end of Cleopatra's power and the collapse of her ambitions. In reality, Actium was a military defeat, not a political execution. Egypt remained intact, its wealth remained vast, its symbolic power remained potent. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria not as a fugitive, but as a ruler preparing for contingencies. Rome, however, had already decided. Octavian understood something essential: Cleopatra alive was a liability. Cleopatra captured would be worse. A living Cleopatra paraded through Rome would become a focal point for dissent, sympathy, and destabilizing narratives. She embodied a version of sovereignty Rome was trying to erase, one that predated the empire and did not depend on Roman conquest for validation. This is why her death must be understood not as a personal tragedy, but as a political outcome. The official story, that Cleopatra chose death by snakebite, is elegant in its simplicity. It frames her end as voluntary, emotional, even theatrical. It removes responsibility from Rome, it suggests closure, and most importantly, it transforms a political execution into a private act. But history rarely operates so cleanly. Cleopatra's death resolved too many problems at once. It eliminated a rival ruler. It erased a competing narrative of power. It allowed Octavian to annex Egypt without the complications of legitimacy or rebellion. And it provided Rome with a story that required no further explanation. In politics, when an outcome benefits one side exclusively and the narrative supporting it comes from that same side, skepticism is not optional. It is necessary. Cleopatra did not die because she lost a battle. She died because she represented a future Rome refused to allow. And that is where the real story begins. Rome did not conquer the Mediterranean merely with legions. It conquered it with dependency. Roads, law, military protection, and trade networks tied provinces to the center, creating a system in which survival depended on compliance. Egypt, under Cleopatra, was the most dangerous exception to this model. Unlike Rome's provinces, Egypt was not structurally dependent on Roman infrastructure. It was self-sufficient, economically decisive, and ideologically distinct. Its power did not flow outward from Rome, it flowed inward, toward it. Grain ships leaving Alexandria fed the Roman populace, stabilized food prices, and prevented unrest in the capital. Any ruler who controlled Egypt controlled the Roman street. This reality terrified Roman leadership. Food riots had toppled careers before. The Roman crowd was volatile, politically weaponized, and acutely sensitive to scarcity. The Senate and later the triumvirs understood that Egypt's grain was not simply an economic asset, it was a political pressure point. Cleopatra's ability to withhold, redirect, or leverage this resource made her a threat no Roman rival could easily counter. She did not need legions in Italy. She already had influence where it mattered most. Rome's traditional strategy for managing powerful regions was client kingship. Local rulers governed in Rome's name, collected taxes, and enforced stability in exchange for protection and recognition. This system worked because it subordinated sovereignty. Cleopatra rejected this model. She ruled Egypt as Egypt, not as a Roman extension. Her authority derived from dynastic continuity and divine kingship, not Roman appointment. That distinction undermined the Roman worldview. If Egypt could remain independent, prosperous, and powerful outside Roman control, then Rome's claim to universal authority was incomplete. Cleopatra's Egypt stood as proof that the Roman order was not inevitable. For a state transitioning from republic to empire, this was intolerable. Octavian understood this better than anyone. His rise depended on a narrative of restoration, restoring order, restoring tradition, restoring Rome itself. Cleopatra's existence contradicted that narrative. She was a reminder that Rome's internal chaos had allowed foreign power to grow influential within its own political sphere. As long as Cleopatra lived, Octavian's claim to absolute authority remained contested. This is why propaganda became essential. Roman writers framed Cleopatra not as a monarch, but as a corrupting influence. Egypt was depicted as decadent, Eastern, irrational, the antithesis of Roman virtue. These stereotypes were not cultural accidents, they were political tools. By feminizing and exoticizing Cleopatra's power, Rome made her dominance seem illegitimate, even dangerous. The message was clear. Rome ruled through discipline and reason. Cleopatra ruled through excess and manipulation. This framing justified her removal. The alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony further intensified Roman anxiety. Antony was not merely a lover, he was a conduit through which Egyptian power entered Roman politics. His distribution of eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children, remembered as the donations of Alexandria, was presented in Rome as treason. In reality, it was a strategic reorganization of power that challenged Rome's monopoly on legitimacy. To Octavian, this was unforgivable. The donations were not about land, they were about recognition. By publicly affirming Cleopatra's sovereignty and elevating her children as rulers, Antony acknowledged an alternative political future, one in which Rome shared authority rather than monopolized it. For Octavian, whose power depended on centralization, this was an existential threat. War then became inevitable. Yet even after Actium, the problem remained unsolved. Cleopatra was defeated but not erased. Egypt still existed. Its institutions still functioned. Its symbolic power still resonated across the eastern Mediterranean. Rome could invade, occupy, and annex, but without Cleopatra's removal, the annexation would remain fragile. Rebellions are born from symbols as much as from armies. A captured Cleopatra marched through Rome in chains would have been a spectacle, but also a rallying point. She would have embodied resistance, loss, and injustice. Rome had learned from experience that executed leaders could become martyrs. Cleopatra's survival, in any form, carried political risk. Her death eliminated all variables. It allowed Octavian to present Egypt's annexation as natural, rather than violent. Without a living ruler to contest the transfer of power, Egypt became a possession rather than a conquest. Cleopatra's absence smoothed the transition from independent kingdom to imperial asset. This is why the circumstances of her death matter. The snakebite narrative absolved Rome of responsibility. It suggested dignity, choice, and finality. It transformed an act of political elimination into a personal decision. Most importantly, it closed the story on Rome's terms. Cleopatra's death was not simply the end of a queen. It was the successful neutralization of an alternative model of power, and Rome could finally breathe. History often compresses complex political realities into decisive moments. For Cleopatra, That moment is almost always the Battle of Actium. Popular narratives treat it as the final collapse of her power, the point at which resistance became futile and death inevitable. This interpretation is convenient, dramatic, and deeply misleading. Actium was a defeat, not a conclusion. The naval engagement in 31 BCE damaged Antony's military position, but it did not eliminate Cleopatra's capacity to rule. Egypt remained uninvaded. Alexandria remained intact. Its treasury remained immense. Cleopatra returned not to a collapsing state but to a functioning capital with administrative continuity and economic leverage. From a strictly political perspective, she was weakened, but far from powerless. Rome understood this. Octavian understood it even better. Power in the ancient world did not vanish with a single battle. It eroded through legitimacy, control, and narrative. Cleopatra still possessed all three in some form. She remained the recognized ruler of Egypt, she controlled its wealth, and she commanded symbolic authority rooted in centuries of tradition. As long as these elements persisted, Cleopatra remained a potential destabilizing force. This is why Octavian did not immediately declare victory. Instead, he moved carefully. His strategy after Actium was not annihilation, but containment. He advanced deliberately, allowing time for internal fractures to widen, for loyalty to erode, and for Cleopatra's options to narrow. This was not mercy, it was calculation. Cleopatra, for her part, did not behave like a defeated monarch awaiting execution. She explored diplomatic channels. She secured resources. She prepared Alexandria for potential siege. And most tellingly, she negotiated, not for survival alone, but for the future of her dynasty. This detail is often overlooked. Cleopatra's concern was not merely her own fate. It was the political continuity of Egypt and the legitimacy of her children. Her attempts to secure recognition for her heirs reveal a ruler still thinking in long-term strategic terms. Such behavior does not align with the image of a woman resigned to death. It aligns with a leader attempting to salvage sovereignty under extreme pressure. Octavian's response was revealing. He offered vague assurances. He delayed concrete guarantees. He avoided explicit commitments. These were not the actions of a conqueror satisfied with victory. They were the tactics of a man managing risk. Octavian had no intention of preserving Cleopatra's line, but he understood that premature confrontation could provoke unrest or resistance. The illusion of negotiation bought time. Meanwhile, Roman propaganda intensified. Cleopatra was increasingly framed as unstable, desperate, and isolated. These portrayals served a dual purpose: undermining her authority within Egypt and justifying decisive action to Roman audiences. By the time Octavian approached Alexandria, the political groundwork had already been laid. Even then, Cleopatra was not immediately eliminated. Her meeting with Octavian, though filtered through Roman sources, suggests caution rather than cruelty. She was not executed on the spot. She was confined, watched, controlled. This interim phase is critical. It indicates that Cleopatra's fate was not spontaneous but managed. Management implies intent. A living Cleopatra posed questions Rome did not want asked. Why had she ruled so effectively? Why had Rome struggled to dominate Egypt without her removal? Why did her death resolve political tension so cleanly? These questions threaten the simplicity of imperial narratives. So history was simplified. The account of Cleopatra's suicide emerged not from Egyptian records but from Roman chroniclers writing under an imperial order invested in moral clarity. Suicide allowed Rome to avoid the stigma of execution. It framed Cleopatra as choosing death over humiliation, preserving a veneer of dignity while eliminating her political presence entirely. Yet the practical details remain implausible. The logistics of smuggling a venomous snake into a heavily guarded royal chamber raise obvious doubts. The absence of eyewitness testimony undermines certainty. The contradictions between sources suggest reconstruction rather than observation. What remains is not evidence, but consensus, a consensus shaped by power. Cleopatra's death in this context reads less like an act of despair and more like the final stage of political containment. Whether she was directly killed, coerced into suicide, or presented with no viable alternative is ultimately secondary. The outcome was the same. Her removal served Rome's interests perfectly, and that is the point. Actium did not seal Cleopatra's fate, it merely made her elimination urgent. Her continued existence threatened to complicate Octavian's transition from warlord to emperor. She embodied a world Rome was trying to suppress, one in which power could exist outside Roman approval. As long as Cleopatra lived, that world remained imaginable. Rome could not afford imagination. So Cleopatra disappeared, not in battle, not on trial, but quietly, efficiently, and with a story that absolved the victors. History remembers Actium as the end. In truth, It was only the beginning of a carefully controlled conclusion. The story of Cleopatra's death is one of the most enduring images in Western history, a queen, alone, choosing a venomous snake over captivity. It is dramatic, symbolic, and emotionally satisfying. It is also extraordinarily convenient for Rome. The image of the asp transformed Cleopatra's end into a personal decision rather than a political event. It suggested agency without power, dignity without resistance, and closure without accountability. Most importantly, it removed Rome from the act itself. No executioner, no order, no crime, just a queen who chose not to live. This framing was not accidental. Roman political culture was deeply aware of optics. Public executions of foreign rulers carried risks, moral, symbolic, and practical. Killing Cleopatra openly would have raised uncomfortable questions about legitimacy and fear. Allowing her death to be framed as suicide solved every problem at once. It preserved Roman authority while appearing merciful. It eliminated a rival without creating a martyr. The snake, then, was not merely a method. It was a narrative device. Ancient sources disagree on the specifics. Some mention an asp, others suggest poison. A few admit uncertainty. What they share is a reluctance to describe direct Roman involvement. This silence is telling. In historical writing, silence often indicates consensus enforced rather than truth discovered. Cleopatra's death occurred under Roman custody. That fact alone complicates any claim of pure autonomy. Her movements were restricted. Her chamber was guarded. Her options were limited. In such an environment, choice becomes a relative concept. This does not require imagining a dramatic assassination. Political elimination is rarely theatrical. It is procedural. Pressure is applied. Alternatives are removed. Outcomes are guided. Cleopatra may have been encouraged towards suicide. She may have been denied any future that made survival meaningful. Or she may have been quietly killed, with the narrative adjusted afterward. The precise mechanism matters less than the structure surrounding it. The structure points to intent. With Cleopatra gone, Egypt became a Roman province overnight. Its treasury was seized, its grain supply was secured. Its religious and political institutions were dismantled or repurposed. There was no transition period, no negotiated settlement, no residual autonomy. The speed of annexation suggests preparation, not improvisation. Octavian emerged from this moment transformed. Within years, he would become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. His authority rested on the elimination of rivals and the stabilization of the state. Cleopatra's death removed the last credible external challenge to his legitimacy. She did not merely lose to him. She enabled his final ascent by disappearing at the exact moment her presence was most inconvenient. This is not coincidence. History often treats Cleopatra as an ending, the last pharaoh, the final chapter of Hellenistic Egypt. In reality, she was also a beginning. The moment Rome completed its transformation from republic to empire, her death marked the point at which alternative centers of power ceased to exist in the Mediterranean world. That is why her story persists. Cleopatra forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about history, that outcomes are often shaped less by destiny than by narrative control. The victors do not merely record events, they frame them. They decide which deaths are tragic, which are honorable, and which require no explanation at all. Cleopatra's death required explanation, so Rome provided one: a snake, a choice, a quiet end. But beneath that story lies a harder reality. Cleopatra was not destroyed by weakness or excess. She was removed because she governed effectively, independently, and symbolically outside Roman authority. She represented a future that did not include empire. Rome ensured that future never arrived. Cleopatra did not die because she was defeated. She died because she could not be allowed to live. And that, more than any serpent, is the true cause of her death.